Hi, I'm the Director for Common Knowledge Trust. We're a New Zealand NGO, and we house all of the Birthing Better online birth classes. Those skills were developed with hundreds of mothers and fathers in the early 1970s, and I was privileged to be involved in that development. And I was asked to carry on these skills into the future and to put them into a non-profit organization, which we have. And over the past 50 years, I have traveled extensively and have talked to tens and thousands of mothers and fathers. And we've just tried to nut out what it is that's happening in childbirth. So, as mentioned in other videos, in the United States from the 60s to the 70s, there was a very high societal message that all pregnant women should go to the very first childbirth preparation classes with their fathers because men were just being permitted in. And those first childbirth preparation classes were skills-based, Lamaze and the Bradley method. In New Zealand, where our trust is, our NGO, and where I live, in the 1950s, Grantley Dick Reed, Childbirth Without Fear, were the first childbirth preparation classes taught here. Those three obstetricians were focused on low-risk normal pregnancies and birth and felt that if women used skills, they'd achieve the three goals of a natural birth, pain-free labor with no medical care. And in New Zealand, women had to be identified as low risk by an obstetrician in order to attend those classes. As mentioned in other videos, this was a huge mistake that was totally unintended, these three obstetricians made. They just should have acknowledged the truth. 100% of pregnant women are going to give birth. Giving birth is an activity that each woman does with her baby, no matter where she births, no matter who is present, her circumstances, or what happens to or around her in the birth. As long as she is conscious, she should use skills in order to cope, manage, work through, deal with, handle, stay on top of, and feel in control as she works through the activity of birthing her baby. Whether she labors and has a vaginal birth, labors and has an unplanned surgical birth, has a planned non-laboring cesarean, or attempts a VBAC, which will be one of those three births. So we really need to understand what the role of the obstetrician is. So when I gave birth in 1970 in the United States, we were all going into the hospitals. The United States actually outlawed midwives by the end of the 1950s in all 50 states. That didn't mean home births didn't occur. There were lay midwives, and there were obstetricians or doctors or nurses, labor and delivery nurses, and Vietnam paramedics who did home births. But there weren't a lot of them, and each state had different rules and regulations. In other developed countries, like the UK or Holland, New Zealand, Australia, Germany, they had midwives. So you have to understand that there were midwives working within the medical profession once the medical profession really took off, which was post-World War II. There really wasn't a scientific medical model really until the beginning of the 20th century. In the Civil War in the United States, it was barbers who did surgery. There were some doctors, but the really scientific medicine has occurred very recent in the history of mankind. And in traditional communities, it was usually your aunt or your mother, your grandmother, your mother-in-law who helped at the birth. So you need to understand that the idea of an obstetrician is quite new within maternity care. In fact, in the United States, the obstetrical profession started in 1952. I had been born, right? Tells you something about me. And you need to understand also that penicillin wasn't available until after the Second World War. There were very few immunizations. There were. Yellow fever was one of them. Rubella, they didn't have anything to deal with that. Rh negative, didn't have anything to deal with that. And when I gave birth in 1970, and we went into the hospital, there were labor and delivery nurses, and the obstetrician came in and delivered my baby, made certain I was okay, and then a pediatrician took care of my baby. So there were a lot of issues around birth. In the generation before me, my mother's generation, women were left alone. They were left alone either if they could afford it in their own private room in a hospital, or they were in a ward. Fathers weren't there. They were in the pub or they were in the waiting room and handing out cigars. And women didn't want to be left alone because there are two elements of childbirth that we must always pay attention to. There are the issues that could become problems that are called risks, and there's suffering, which has nothing to do with risks. It has to do with lack of skills. Women just lack skills, and they have labor pains that can hurt, and labor can last for days, and they get exhausted and they suffer. And you have to have a perspective about this. So in 1970, the cesarean rate was 4.5%. It was done if a woman's life was at risk, and everyone else labored. That did not mean that everybody coped well. It did not mean that everybody had a good outcome. It did not mean that everybody had a reasonable birth. What it meant was that the medical profession didn't yet have either the diagnostic tools or the ability to reduce or prevent issues from becoming problems. So they delivered breech babies. Some of them died because the cord either prolapsed or their head got stuck in the pelvis. Twins, one could die, both could die. They could be locked, where their chins are locked together and couldn't come out. Or they could have problems with the placenta or transfusion problems between the two of them. Women had health issues. In fact, if you really want to get clear about what the word natural, when it refers to in birth, really means, it means anything that might or could happen may happen. So when people talk about low-risk women, they're really defining it from strictly a medical viewpoint. But that doesn't mean that that low-risk woman copes well with labor pains, or that her baby doesn't have a problem, or that she doesn't develop a problem. In fact, there's a UK woman by the name of Marjorie Tew, who did some research. And to paraphrase it extensively, very much so, no matter how many risk factors, there is no correlation between how easy it is for a baby to get out of a woman's body or how well she copes. So we've created this oppositional approach to childbirth, and midwives and obstetricians are considered to be in opposition to one another. So what is an obstetrician? Well, it's a man or a woman. They're called human beings, right? That's it. They could be your mother, your sister, your father, right? They're human beings. They chose to go into a field of medicine that's called gynecology and obstetrics. They deliver babies and take care of women's female problems or issues. They are not monsters. They are not wandering around with a knife in their hand. They are not dying to get to the golf course. They are not ignoring you. They have a job to do. And I want to give you a perspective of this because someone told me this, because it was families who developed the skills and they asked me to carry on. So here's one of the perceptions that I was told. Imagine that you had something that you needed done by a professional. You didn't know how to do it. A car mechanic, paint your house, a lawyer, an accountant. You go in there, you tell them what needs to be fixed, and you leave them to it, because we have a professional class, because not all of us want to develop all of those skills and do them ourselves. Some people do. There are plenty of people who can do a tune-up in a car, but they can't, redo the engine. And with the new cars, who knows what people can do. So we have professionals, and we just turn it over to them and let them do it. But if you go into a hairdresser, you expect them to do it the way you want. An obstetrician falls in the middle. They have no obligation to do a birth the way you imagine it, because they know the truth. And you do too. There's no way to know what your birth's going to be like. And that's just the truth. So you can go in with a birth plan as long as your arm. They have no obligation to provide that for you. And if you do not want to have any of the medical assessments, the monitoring and procedures that your obstetrician is comfortable with, or your hospital requires, or your insurance company requires, then never see one. Never go in the hospital. If you don't want any of those things, you have the legal right not to do that. Just don't. It's as simple as that. If your kid's sick, you don't have a legal responsibility to immediately take it to a pediatrician. You take it to a pediatrician when you feel your kid has an issue. Same way, if you're not feeling well, you don't necessarily go right to the doctor. You wait, see if you really need to go to the doctor. So, and car accidents and strokes and heart attacks don't occur in the hospital. So if you don't want any of the assessments and monitoring procedures, don't go. So if you do use an obstetrician, then you are within their sphere of expertise. And that means that you have to work with them, not against them. So this is what we learned as Birthing Better Families in the early 70s. When we had no choices, we became skilled. That means we reduced the suffering. We didn't suffer. We didn't necessarily like it. We didn't like birth. A lot of us didn't like it at all, and some of us thought we were going to die. But we used skills to cope, to manage, to work through, to deal with, to handle, to stay on top of, and to feel in control. And if you have other words or phrases you want to use, include them. In other words, birth is happening to us. It's a one-off, it's infrequent, it's dynamic, and the memory of it lasts our lifetime. So if we're experiencing internal sensations and they are uncomfortable for us, we use skills to cope. If things are being done to us, then we use skills to cope. We didn't like lying on our back to have a vaginal exam done. It was what it was. So we use skills to cope. We didn't always like the mannerisms of the labor and delivery nurses or the obstetricians, or that the obstetrician just came in, checked us, left, arrived at the birth, made certain everything was all right, left, came in again. Maybe we didn't like that. It was our baby's birth. We got pregnant to have a baby. We didn't get pregnant to have much of a relationship to the professional we chose to bring their professional skills to our pregnancy and birth. So back in the 70s, when women would thank obstetricians, we thanked them for being a good professional and helping us, even though we may not have liked a lot of things that went on. When the next group of natural birth advocates came online in the 70s and the 80s, they were saying women shouldn't love obstetricians. They're the ones doing the birth. We know we're doing the birth, but we appreciate professionals, and an obstetrician is a professional. When the natural birth advocates in the 1970s and 80s started talking about choice being important, women should have say no to, and what were they saying no to? The assessments, monitoring, and procedures. There were the evidence-based practice, the guidelines of practice, the standards of care that whoever considered to be right. Now, because in the United States, multiple millions of mothers and fathers went into hospitals under obstetrical care with labor and delivery nurses and used Lamaze and Bradley skills, even though those were the beginning skills, and they didn't work for many people, and they were targeted to low-risk women. The fact is that labor and delivery nurses and obstetricians saw multiple millions of women and men working, handling, coping better. Women of my generation didn't suffer as much as everybody else beforehand because we use skills. That's what we want you to do. We want you to change your birth, and we want you to change the message you give to your sons and daughters when they grow up. We want society to say to you it's normal and natural for you to learn birth and birth coaching skills when you're pregnant, self-learn them whatever way you do that, and then use them when you birth your baby, in and around the obstetrical care you have or in the hospital. But in the 1970s, when multiple millions of women were using skills, the evidence-based practice of that day changed, and it became more liberal because those people caring for us in maternity care saw women coping better, so they relaxed. So if you have low risk, doesn't mean you can't develop risks, But risks don't mean that there's necessarily a problem that's going to unfold. If you know you have risks and you want to attempt a more natural birth with less medical monitoring, assessments, and procedures, then when you use skills and you cope better, you're a better negotiator. And this is what we learned. When women were visibly and sounding like they were suffering, the caring people, the men and women in the maternity profession, do not want you to suffer. And so they do things to try to help you not suffer. Because we, as modern women, were absolutely hell bent on having modern society reduce the risks that occurred in societies where there was no medical care. Doesn't matter whether it's in maternity care or anything else. I mean, my goodness, take a look at modern medicine and how it has reduced or prevented risk or solved problems that exist around the world that can't be solved. I mean, you've got to be realistic about this. So your obstetrician is not working against you. They are a professional, and they are there to bring their skills to your birth. If you follow along and want to just do what they say, that's fine. Use skills, because you're going to have to cope and manage with all the assessments, monitoring procedures that you may encounter. If you don't want those things, and those assessments, monitoring procedures are all called interventions, and it's implied by the natural birth movement that interventions are imposed on women and unnecessary. So if you see yourself as low risk and you do not want an assessment or monitoring or a procedure, the more skilled you are, and the more you look like you're coping and sound like you're coping and staying on top of things, the more you are going to be able to work with those things if they're required in your hospital by your doctor or insurance company, and you're more likely to negotiate. So many, many birthing better families, when we started developing the skills in the 1970s, were very high risk and multiple risks. Who knows why? I don't have any medical training. However, we focused on skills. And we were the first generation, groups of women, to have vaginal births after cesareans, after classical cesareans. We were the first generation of people to say, if we have these risks, we still want to try to give birth vaginally, go through labor and give birth vaginally, as long as everything looks okay. Because if you have a risk and you are being monitored, they know whether everything's okay. And the more we coped and managed, the more our individual obstetricians or labor and delivery nurses worked with us, because they felt privileged with being with women and men who were coping well and working together well. It didn't frighten them. They calmed down. So we have to stop doing what we're doing to the obstetrical people in the obstetrical profession. It's unkind. It's unkind, and it's silly, really. And it's been silly since the mid-70s. These are professional men and women who took the time to learn about obstetrics, and they bring their skills. Now, are they sort of a nervous group of people that are really trying to prevent all sorts of issues from becoming problems? Yes, they are. And why is that? Well, we'll take the U.S. for example. There has never been a lawsuit for an unnecessary cesarean. So just listen to that. There's only been lawsuits for people who don't feel that the care was given fast enough. So when we're critiquing the obstetrical model, it is us as consumers that have demanded that they do not leave us with an undiagnosed risk or a problem that isn't solvable through the medical community. This is us doing this, the collective of us. So if the collective of us wants to have a better relationship with our obstetricians, the collective of us now needs to become skilled. And it needs to become a societal message that you pass on to your brothers and sisters, you pass on to your sons and daughters, you pass on to your friends and neighbors. There are enough skills-based methods out now that everybody should self-learn them. And they should tell their obstetrician what skills they're learning. Demand that those skills just be put in their notes. I learned breathing, relaxation, whatever it is. And then at birth, you say to the labor and delivery nurses and obstetricians, if you see us coping and managing well, praise us. And if you see us not doing it, look in our notes and encourage us to use those skills. We can do this. I can't do it. You can do it. And so please share this. This is a part of a playlist. Please share information about birthing better. Please share information about all skills-based methods. Obstetricians, be kinder to them. Don't demand, work with them, because you become skilled and they can see that. Okay, talk to you again. Bye-bye.